So next up is Ploug, lead at Spotify, talking about how to enable open source for your organization. So I'll give you some time to sit down for you to prepare. Ready?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
You're ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Then please give Per a big applause.
All right, so I think the sound is working. At least I sound weird. Okay, so it's interesting to be on a stage again. It's interesting to do a presentation where you actually wear pants. Okay, so into this very serious mode. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about open source, but more in the context of how you prioritize and take ownership of it. And the background here is kind of that open source is now like a natural and also critical part of pretty much all companies, not just tech companies. But at the same time, these companies kind of struggle to take ownership of the actual topic of open source. We treat it as this kind of magical, mythical, anarchist thing that just happens organically inside of your company. It's like, oh, cool, you want to do open source. That sounds amazing. But you don't really get the time to do it. And you also kind of forget why you do it, and you don't really apply any kind of value to it as well. So, and also the other part is that if you start questioning it, if you start saying, should we really do open source, then you're instantly uncool, and no one wants to be uncool. So, at the same time, open source is also extremely valuable for everyone. So, it's also important to acknowledge that there's a big value, and that it's also extremely hard work to actually do. So we're kind of doing ourselves a disservice by making it magical and making it into this very special thing. We need to start treating it as actual quantifiable work, where there's actual value and there's effort and maybe even terrible words like a return of investment when you think about open source. So this talk is for you if you're an engineer, or maybe you're a team lead, or maybe you're a business owner, and you're wondering how can we actually take ownership for this thing and maybe make it a bit more like an actual just business process that we have, like anything else, like accounting or project inside your company. Because again, open source is work, it's hard work, and it's important that we spend our time and resources properly. So a bit about me. I actually worked at Umbraco for 10 years, and then I thought, I would like to be in enterprise IT. And so I joined Zalando and worked on their open source team there, and worked on later on security and privacy there as well, and have a pretty good sense of how enterprises deal with this topic of ownership, and also on topic that kind of crosses across the organization where there's really no one who actually owns it. And now I work at Spotify at their OSPO, which is an open source program office, which is lingo for basically we need someone to take ownership of this topic of open source. So with that said, there's also a bit of a disclaimer here. This is not a Zalando way of doing things. It's not a Spotify model of open source, and it's definitely not a Umbraco way. So it's kind of a mix of a lot of different things, and also some best practices from the industry, and also things I've seen work in different contexts. So it's three things I'll talk about, and you can kind of apply it in your own context. There's a lot of this you can just say, that's rubbish, we don't need that, and then there's maybe things you can apply that will make sense to you. So let's start with the companies who love open source. When you search for open source on LinkedIn, you get 20,000 jobs. And when you look at where they actually talk about open source in their ads, they typically mention it under the perks. It's like, yeah, you can do open source here. We love open source, and we are very committed to open source. Or it's also found in the qualifications area as well, where it's like, it would be great if you have open source experience. If you worked on open source projects before, we want to hire you. So it's kind of this thing of companies really want to have engineers who have worked in open source before, and they also see open source as this kind of perk they can offer up as, maybe it's to be cool, I don't know. It's like, but they don't see it as this value-generating activity. It's more like a thing they give away, like a free bike. It's like, you can also do open source here. It's pretty cool. So we kind of need to change that perspective a little bit. So I'm going to talk about three things. First of all, just talk about actually how do you prioritize and how do you actually assess value of open source inside your organization. That's actually where it all starts, realizing why do you even do this? And maybe also if you can't come up with a good reason, maybe don't do it. If you actually do it, then we're going to talk about supporting and rewarding employees who actually engage in open source inside your company. And finally, we're going to spread this a bit more out and talk about ownership in a general perspective of the open source ecosystem. So, prioritization. That's a wonderful, wonderful business word. You can see I've been in enterprise IT for 4 years now. So why do companies do open source? Why do they care about it? Like for Umbraco, it's pretty clear why they do it. They have an open source product, and they want to make money based on that, basically. But for a company like Zalando or Spotify or Google or Microsoft, they have different motivations. And also for a lot of you here who probably work at agencies using Umbraco, or maybe you're a big customer of Umbraco and so on, you have different reasons. And the key here is more you have to figure out what those specific reasons are. And you can say the generic reasons for doing it, you can drive hiring, you can attract talent, you can be this company where engineers can also do open source. But it can also be a way of exposing what interesting things you solve. If you saw the demos before, he talked a lot about how they solve specific problems in their context, and that can be enticing for people who think those kinds of problems are interesting. If you're getting a bit bigger scale, you can also think about you can actually influence the industry. You can create a standard for something that you like the way it's done. You can see like Google released Kubernetes, and that's pretty much an industry standard now. You can also talk about Umbraco being somewhat of a standard of CMSs in the Microsoft space and so on. And then you also have the employee angle of it can be very rewarding and can also be a personal growth thing to actually lead an open source project as an engineer. It gives you some extra abilities that you don't have just doing normal engineering work. So there's many different reasons, and that's kind of the point is you have to kind of pick your reasons why you actually do it and start thinking about them in terms of, oh, this is why we want to do it, this is the value we want to generate, this is the effort we might need to actually do those things. And I think anyone who has done like a business case or a pitch before will say, oh, that sounds very oddly familiar. Can we do that for open source? And of course you can. So it is really just boiling it down to saying, let's treat it as a business case. Let's talk about what kind of value can you get from doing whatever open source activity you want to do. That value you can extract from that requires some sort of effort. It will require some engineering time, so maybe a product manager, maybe you need to do some marketing, maybe you need to come to a conference to talk about the thing. And then set some goals. Like, what do you actually want to get out of this, and what is the markers that actually tells you that you are succeeding here? That could be something as odd as how many times has this been mentioned on Twitter, or how many adopters do we have, how many package downloads, what kind of impact do we have in whatever we want to target here? Of course, these things should fit into your system. Companies have various complicated ways of prioritizing things, like seeing how Zalando prioritizes things for a big like e-commerce business. There's a huge system in place of actually prioritizing things. And if you cannot assign value to your open source thing you want to do, you immediately lose because you have no arguments in a bigger context. They would just say, okay, why do you want to do this? And then you come with your, well, it's the right thing to do, and open source is cool. And they would just say, well, okay, we don't care. But you can do it in your free time if you want, because we like open source. And then you go back and you do it in your free time, and so on. And then you have kind of a problem. So you need to fit it into your context where you are, and you need to understand why could the company actually care about doing this thing, make it very clear what is the value, and then actually get some resources or time to actually do the thing. And then follow up saying, we are now reaching these goals, let's continue. So that's it. It sounds very boring, and it is. It is just treating open source as work. So, so you basically want to elevate it to this, like, let's talk about impact and purpose. So working a bit backwards is that in an ideal situation, you would consider open source on equal terms to any other kind of business activity in your business. That kind of starts with some team that can actually take ownership of this thing. Someone actually comes and say, we would like to prioritize this. And these are the goals you want to achieve, and therefore we have some value and so on. And that goes back again to a common understanding of this is the purpose of why we're doing this thing. If you don't have the purpose, then why are you even having this conversation? So, we can make it a bit more concrete, saying, we would like to invest 10 hours per week for the next 3 months because we would like to do this unique thing called a content picker. We aim to have 10 adopters after 3 months and 20 after 6 months. Okay, that sounds good. And we feel the content market is wide open. There's basically no other people in the content picker market currently, so we think we could be a leading content picker provider for this ecosystem. And within 12 months, we feel that we could maybe position the person running this thing as an Umbraco MVP, because this would be such a substantial thing. That is a business case. And now you're actually pitching this to a company with all the information that they need, such as they can make the basic math of saying this is going to cost. I even don't know the rates for agencies. Now, yes, you can clearly see I've been out of this game for way too long. Let's pretend it only costs like 200 to 300 euros per hour of billable hours. 120 hours over 3 months. So would we justify paying 24,000 euros for 10 adopters and 48,000 for 20? And is it actually worth being MVP for the price of 96,000 euros? Who knows? And the business can say, well, if we have like an MVP status, we can kind of brag to our potential customers, and that might substantially increase our chances of winning like bigger contracts. So we assess it's worth the effort. Okay, so that's it. And anyone who's done a pitch before is saying, oh, this is like super boring. This is what we do all the time. Yes, and that is the point. Because like any other business task, open source work is work. And that is what we should treat it as. So let's go on a little bit. So once we've kind of found our way to prioritize work, and then we need to think about how do we treat our employees who spend their time on this. So how do we reward, and how do we support, and how do we protect them? So interestingly enough, when you look at the open source ecosystem as a whole, like 50% of all contributions to open source projects comes outside of working hours or on weekends. And I think most people who have done open source can probably recognize that statistic, that this is something that people engage in their free time and during weekends. It's fun to code for open source. And that's not a problem in itself. It's a problem if you work on open source on behalf of your company, because you're putting a lot of value into a project, but at the same time you actually have a full-time job to do at this time. So this can easily lead to burnout, basically, that you start thinking, well, I have like 40 hours of actual development work during the week, and then I also spend my evenings and my weekends on this thing as well. Okay, fuck open source. So then you have the burnout, and it's also not really sustainable to depend on free labor. It's very hard to make a plan a year into the future for a project if this is something some dude does in the weekend. Would you like to adopt something knowing that it's like some random person who does it in the weekend every once in a while? Doesn't seem like a great idea. So it's more if you are actually serious about this and you actually apply some value and purpose on these things, you should also ensure that your employees can actually do it during working hours. And this is kind of where it gets hard for a lot of companies because, again, if we talk about the billable hours, that's like direct income, whereas like open source is a bit of a bet. So, but it's also important that we do it, because if we look at, again, the bigger ecosystem, this thing of not assigning work time, but just having people do it in after hours and weekends, that benefits a very specific kind of person, and I'm one of them, the white IT dude. And I like coding JavaScript in the evening. That is fun, but that's not for everyone, and it shouldn't be. That should not be the bar of how you can enter open source, because as I mentioned in the beginning, all these companies have like open source experience as a qualifier for a job. And we're kind of excluding a lot of people by not enabling them to do this during working hours. 3% of the people in open source are women. That's a very low number. And also because of very systemic societal issues, it is historically women who has been doing most of the, you could say, the home duties. That is wrong, and but that's how it is. And again, like down with the patriarchy and all that. But we need to enable other people than just white dudes to do open source. And one of the ways is to make sure that you can do it during the working hours, so that people who actually have better things to do during their weekends and free time do not have to also sit and code some JavaScript that doesn't work. Again, personal experience. And also, if you look at the pull request that comes from women, there's a 4% higher acceptance rate of pull requests from women because their code is of general higher quality. So also keep that in mind. We're excluding half of the population here, and they actually produce better work. Anyways, so one thing, if you actually succeed by enabling your employees into engaging in open source on your behalf, you also have to protect them. One of the things we did at Zalando in our open source team there was to actually establish that we had a clear policy on what happens when your employees meet the outside world. the terrible, terrible outside world, where there is harassment. There's like various like reply guys and other creepy dudes. And again, I know women can also be creepy, but I think, again, speaking out of statistics, then I think it's like creepy dudes mostly. But there we actually established that we had a policy of what happens if you engage in open source on our behalf and you actually receive harassment. The company needs to have an idea of how to actually take responsibility for that kind of thing. And it might just be that HR knows that this could happen, can be supportive, can help contact the police, can help gather evidence, and maybe give you time off to kind of process the whole situation. That's maybe all you need to do as a company, but that's like, again, up to you. It's more, have a plan, because they are doing it on your behalf, and they are bringing value and purpose to your company. Okay? And then the last part, have an idea of how open source contribution actually plays into their careers. Because again, as I said in the beginning, companies like people with open source experience because they have all these unique skills. They start thinking about code as a product. They start thinking more about communication, owning a roadmap, leadership and diplomacy, and they definitely have impact beyond the company. And these are valuable traits, and also on a journey towards more seniority. So you need to think these into your career frameworks of how do we actually take these activities and make it part of our promotion story for our employees. That's also part of taking ownership. So that you have your employee support systems in place, you reward them and you protect them just like any other work, because open source work is work. Yes, thank you. You have to do it louder, otherwise people think I'm an idiot on the video. Okay. So the last thing is talking about ownership beyond your own projects. Because like, open source is not just something you do. It's very rare that you just produce an open source project that has no dependencies at all and doesn't build on top of anything else. It very rarely happens. Like most of the code you probably produce probably have something to do with Umbraco in some way. So think that into how you actually take ownership of open source. You probably also have a lot of dependencies to other smaller things. There's nice utilities that help you do your work as well, and you don't have to build all these things. But still, the way we think about open source is still like this magical, amazing thing that we can just pull in these things for free without really wondering where they come from and who actually maintains them. And we do need to start doing that, because if we don't think about the general sustainability of the environment that we're in, then at some point this environment will break. And if things break that is outside your control, then you're kind of screwed. Because if some critical component is not maintained anymore, you basically have two choices. You can either start maintaining it yourself, or you would have to face a very costly migration. So that's kind of the two options you have. So if you don't really manage that risk, then you have no control over that situation. And you do need to have that. Otherwise, you're just pulling a lot of things into your company without really knowing what will happen to them or where they come from, or are they even supported. So, interesting statistic here, and this is from Black Duck, and Black Duck mostly audits enterprise source code. So this might be outside the norm, but basically of the source code they audit, 88% of these code bases contains dependencies which have not been updated in 2 years, meaning that the maintainers have not updated them for 2 years. So they're completely dead, basically. And if you know anything about source code, if it's older than 6 months, run away. Don't touch that thing, because it's behind on dependencies with a couple of versions. There's probably like a ton of known security issues in there and so on. And maybe it's like a smaller thing that no one really uses, but then it's just because the security issue has not been discovered yet. And because no one is maintaining it, no one is really reacting to any kind of potential issues that can be in there. So again, thinking of something that's like 2 years old in your code base and you don't know who's actually maintaining it is kind of scary. Also part of the aspect of the wider ecosystem is that we've had a lot of bigger security issues over the years. Like the most recent one is like Log4j. I don't know how many spent December patching Log4j. No, you're not really in the Java community, so it's only me apparently. But because of this, we've had a decree by the White House saying that we must secure our supply chains for open source. And so the Linux Foundation and OpenSSF has established these many things they want maintainers to start doing to actually secure the supply chain of software. And they're both mostly applied to the top 10,000 projects in the world that's most critical. So it's not Umbraco. It's mostly like big Java components that's used in banks and so on. But it's still in the wider ecosystem, this is going to be table stakes for most projects to even be considered by anything that handles critical data. So that means that you need to have increased security education, risk audit, like security audits, risk management. You need to have a bill of materials for your projects. You also need to start reacting to various security updates and so on and so on. And a lot of this is going to be handled by a broader initiative for the industry, but a lot of this will also fall on the maintainers themselves. Meaning that if you maintain a project that is used by any bigger corporation, you will have more work to do to actually maintain your project. So the workload of doing this in your free time or your weekend is just going to go bigger and bigger and bigger because of this focus on security. So that's also part of the problem. And then we have, this is a survey done by Tightlift. Half of the maintainers out there don't feel they are compensated enough for actually working on open source. Like half of them feel that they're doing a lot of work for free, which they naturally are. But that's the biggest thing they dislike about this thing, that no one really pays them. So when you start to have this discontent or dislike for something, you can also foresee that a lot of people will actually stop doing this thing. And then we have the problem with unmaintained projects that you don't want to do about. How do you patch them, and do you even know that you actually use them, and so on and so on. So that's also part of the problem, is that we have maintainers who are kind of getting to the point of saying we really need to be paid for doing all this stuff, and we know that more work is just coming. And then we have on the consumer side. On the consumer side, is like there's a vast difference on how companies adopt software. If you adopt something that's really expensive, you do everything in your power to reduce the risk of that adoption, because you're kind of putting money on the table yourself. So if you're paying like €1 million for, and that's I guess cheap for SAP, if you're paying €1 million for something, then you really want to make sure that you do the right thing. So you get reassurances from the company producing it, you get support agreements, you get consultants to help you, you get at least a promise this thing is going to exist for 5-10 years, so you can really do the migration, because this is going to be a critical component. So as soon as companies actually put money on the table, they do all these risk reduction things. But for a thing that doesn't cost anything, the mindset is totally different, because, well, it's free to take on, so there's basically no risk. But that's not correct. That's just kind of the first step. It's free to put into your business, but as soon as you start putting something into your business that actually is critical, it starts being everywhere. So let's pretend that OpenSSL is adopted into your company everywhere, which it very likely is if you use HTTPS or you do any sort of financial transfer. OpenSSL is just as important as SAP for your company, likely. But no one is really thinking about, let's make sure this company is actually properly paid so we can continue using OpenSSL. For a very long time, they had a budget of, like, I don't know, 10,000 euros a year to maintain this. And I think the joke was that it was basically 2 guys named Steve maintaining it. And so we have these critical things, and as long as they're free, we don't really care what happens to them. We just put open source inside of our companies, and we don't really care what happens. We don't reduce the risk in any way. And again, you can again tell I've spent way too long in enterprise IT because we talk about risk reduction. But there's just a huge difference. And the cost of adopting something here without really thinking about the risk is that it's going to be just as expensive to migrate to something else, or get rid of this thing again, or take ownership of it yourself. You just don't think about it up front, because up front it is free. Again, the saying of open source projects is that it's free like a puppy. So again, you can pick up any puppy, and the puppy might be free, but that thing needs to eat at some point. You also need to replace the couch it destroys at some point, and so on and so on. So open source is free as in a puppy. And so the reason why I'm telling you all these stats is because that we need to think about ownership, not just for yourself or your employees or why you do it, but also because we need to think about it end to end. And there, all these projects are important for you as well, because you have a bunch of people you rely on, and they are outside your control. You cannot do anything to get any open source project to do as you want, unless you give them an incentive. You need to create an environment where they actually willingly want to update their projects, not just because they have some free time on a weekend. So there are means of actually creating this environment, and my favorite is that you give them money. That's a pretty good way of actually getting people to do what you want. That's why you go to work and you write C#. Just give them money, because then you actually create an environment where they can make a choice of saying, should I spend my hours on consulting that pays a salary, or should I spend time on open source, which is also paying my salary now, because some people are actually giving me money to do it. If there's like zero money on one end and a lot of money on the other end, people will eventually make that choice towards money, because they need to pay for their house or their car or their kids and so on and so on. There are of course other ways to support them as well. Like a company like Umbraco has like a really well-structured way of doing that now through like commercial offerings, of doing partnerships and add-ons and support deals and so on and so on. And that's much easier thing to actually convince companies to do. Because actually when you go through the process of procurement inside of a big company, they're like, you want to pay what for nothing? The whole idea of paying something that is free is absurd to most companies. Like, why do you want to pay for this? They don't want money. But they do, and they do need them. They don't know always how to ask for it, but they do need money to make that choice. And you as a consumer need to create that environment and that incentive for them to keep maintaining the thing that you depend on. Otherwise, you're going to end up in a costly migration later on. And that is risk reduction. And also, I think I would also specifically like to call out one project, which is like Image Sharp. I think you all know that specific project, because I think pretty much all of you create websites with a lot of pictures on them that's like nicely cropped and so on. It's done by a gentleman called James Jackson South. He used to be at this conference and be part of this community, but now he's doing Image Sharp full time. And I saw he had another blog post the other day about he's going to change the license of his open source project because no one is giving him money. There's very few people. And looking at his funding page, he has 17 sponsors right now. And I know that Umbraco is running on, what, 1 million websites? 750,000? And he has 17 sponsors. And this is not a complaining session or pointing fingers of any of you, but it's just like, it should be humanly possible to maybe make somewhat of a living when actually 750,000 websites use your code. And a lot of agencies are using his code as well. So I'm just calling out James specifically because it's one of those projects that actually is extremely important, but you just don't see it. It's below the surface. You see Umbraco and you support Umbraco and you're here as well, you're part of the community, and that is amazing. But below the surface, there are all these utility things that is completely overlooked and not really valued in the way that it should be. So the next time you crop an image for a customer, maybe just think of James and give him money. One thing we specifically did at Spotify was we created an open source fund. We set aside 100,000 euros this year as kind of a trial to see how it goes, and we sponsored 8 projects. It's a mix of a lot of different things and a lot of challenges, and I can talk to you about this like off stage, how we did that, but we're sponsoring everything from like audio codecs, which is obviously something we need, to test containers, to a team that actually supports Log4j, which we highly depend on, and so on. And that's a good way because it gives us 2 benefits. One, we support the projects and reduce our risk of depending on them, because we are not going to move away from any of these things, basically. We need them, they're critical. But it also creates a conversation inside the company of actually highlighting, oh, we use that thing? That's interesting. So you actually get a sense of what do you actually depend on. And it gives your engineers a much better idea of where they should spend their time, also in regards to contributions. So I think just the last like pointy comment I have about that is that going back to those companies who say they love open source and they care about open source, it is really hard to claim that you care about open source if you do not have a strategy for addressing sustainability. I'm not saying any of the companies in this room can fix the world, and also the 100,000 that Spotify has put into a fund is not going to fix anything. It needs to be a collective effort that you, as a business, decides that we need to reduce the risk here, and also not because it's the right thing, but because it actually reduces your risk. That is the business case. So funding open source projects is a risk reduction exercise, and that's kind of how you can sell it inside of your business. So, in summary, you really need to identify why you're doing this. If you cannot identify why you're doing open source, don't do it. It's fine. You're not uncool if you don't do it. Just be upfront about it. Don't try to create a situation where you kind of want people to do it, but really for free, and you don't really want to engage in the thing. More accept that you're doing it for a reason, apply value, and then invest the needed effort for it. Also, think about how you integrate open source work into how you actually look at employees, both in regards to careers and HR, and protect them, keep them safe. And then the last thing, reduce the risk of relying on open source by investing in the sustainability. Again, it's a risk reduction thing. And then I think, again, as I said before, a lot of the business people or people who have written a pitch before, well, this sounds pretty obvious. This is how we do everything. And that's true. There's nothing new in this. This is all known information already. This is just in the context of open source, because open source work is work. Thank you very much.